Sharon Louden is an artist, educator, and editor of the book. Sharon, hold it up. The artist is called.
I got to hold it up.
Okay, good. The artist is called, and it's up there. The artist is cultural producer, Living and Sustaining a Creative Life, a collection of essays by 40 visual artists published last year. Lenka is one of the artists featured in the book. And Sharon and Lenka both have extensive ties to the Blanton. I am lucky to have known them both for many years, and the Blanton has worked by each of them in our collection. Our deputy director, Carter Foster, wrote the introduction to Sharon's first book, and the art on the cover of the book that inspired this tour was designed by UT MFA alumna Zoe Charlton, who is another contributor. And I know that the tour is also partially underwritten. Its reach to marginalized communities is underwritten by the Ford Foundation, which is headed by UT alum Darren Walker. So we've got a lot of Austin love in this room. As you will hear tonight, Sharon and Lenka's artistic practices reach far beyond their own studios. I admire them for the ways they help us understand some of the very real and philosophical challenges confronting artists, and for their deep commitment to helping make the lives of other artists better. We are very lucky to be one of 100 stops, yes, 100, on the international book tour Sharon has organized that has taken her from Omaha, Nebraska to Australia and to university campuses as diverse as Arizona State, Yale, and my favorite, England's Bath Spa University.
That's true. Over there.
I googled it to make sure it existed and it wasn't made up. I'll let Sharon explain why she created the book, but I wanted to also offer a little bit of background of my own. Sharon set out to create her book in part to dispel some of the entrenched, I need to grab something, sorry. To dispel some of the entrenched misperceptions about artists, namely the sort of heroic artist as a solitary genius who works in isolation, epitomized by Jackson Pollock or Vincent van Gogh. If you need any proof of just how pervasive this myth has become, I offer this bottle of wine that I recently came across in San Diego called The Tortured Artist, and I drank. The cliche of the artist as a depressed recluse who is difficult and fragile and needs to be treated differently from the rest of society has troubling implications that we all grapple with and that this book seeks to redress.
Correct.
Good, I'm glad you yes. With varied voices and experiences, it underscores the great value that artists have in society, revealing how many artists function as change agents in their communities. Tonight, in addition to talking about the value of artists in our society, we will also discuss the many ways we can define being a successful artist that go beyond the inherited notion that you have to have a New York gallery or even live in New York for that matter. The structure of the program tonight's a little different than our usual programs. We're going to talk together for about 30 minutes and leave the remainder of the hour for questions and answers, since this is really meant to be conversational among all of us. And I also want to invite everyone to join us for a book signing in the lobby next to the museum shop immediately following our conversation. And finally, we'd like to extend our thanks to the City of Austin, to the Carolyn Harris Hinson Centennial Endowment for their support of this program. I would also like to extend thanks to Sharon's husband and project manager, Vince Valega, who has masterminded 72 great programs for this book tour to date and only has about 28 more to go. So please join me in welcoming Sharon Louden and Lenka Clayton.
All right, so what do you want to do? You want me to start?
I want you to start. You're an amazing advocate for artists, and I want you to explain.
That's really nice.
And I want you to explain a little bit.
I don't know if I am, but.
I want you to explain a little bit how this book, what the motivations were for this book.
Okay, so first of all, I would never have met Lenka without you. So thank you very much. I asked a few people who I really trust when I was vetting for this book. I went from 400 artists to 40, and the criteria of the people I choose, first and foremost, they must be very generous. Mm-hmm. They must give a lot to artists naturally, mm-hmm. Not for things that they may think they're going to get. I sort of hate that. Actually, I really hate that. And then people who are making strides as far as examples for other artists. Mm-hmm. So the way that this came about was in 2011, I was approached to, I did a panel at the College Art Association conference called How to Make a Living With or Without a Dealer, and 400 people showed up at that panel. I'll never forget, I asked everybody, why are you here? It's either, it's really good that you're here, and it's really bad that you're here, because it's like dependent on that system. So my publisher was in the audience. You never know who's in the audience. So she came up to me and said, we really would like for you to do a book. And I said, I can't write an artist statement. I'm not going to do a book. And she, you know, artist statements, who is artist in the audience? Are there a lot of artists? Oh, my people. Awesome. I just didn't feel comfortable writing a book, but she said, what would you want to do? And I said, I would really want to be able to have artists start a conversation about how to sustain a creative life, because the art world isn't transparent. So I also decided to make these books a shared projects. These books, everybody splits the royalties, not like they're big royalties, they're not outstanding. Carter and I were just talking about this. Carter's a contributor to this book, so the checks have been like, the first check was $10.04 a person, the highest check was $51.26. But the point is to take this as a platform and then use it to create conversation. And then through this tour, this is our 72nd stop, we cull information from your voices, and then through these foundations that have supported this project, data is going to be shared, and hopefully will raise the value and allow for people to see that the artist of hero is dead. But also in the Q&A is really important that I usually ask artists to say, what do you need and what do you want? Because usually, if you don't know what you need, you know what you want. Every artist knows what they want, I think, off the top of their head. And so when artists answer that question, somebody in the audience can probably fulfill that for you. And so from this tour, people have gotten jobs, exhibition opportunities, and certainly validation. So it's been more of like a movement. We've met over 4,500 people on this tour so far since March 2nd.
That's amazing. And only 27 stops more to go.
27, yeah.
You're going to get all continents, I feel certain of it. Lenka, one of the reasons that you were a contributor to this book, I think, hinges on a project that is why I first came to know you, which is a project called the Artistic Residency in Motherhood. And I wondered if, I'm a huge fan of the project. I was lucky enough to share some work at an exhibition in Austin at Test Site out of Lawrence Miller's home. But you made perfect sense for Sharon's book because the ways you made this residency a model for other people. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and how it was partially spurred by your move to Pittsburgh from the UK also, and that, I think, and the birth of your first child.
Okay, sure. And I just also want to say that I'm really glad to be here with you too. Before I sort of go into that, before I met Sharon, so I was connected through you to Sharon, but before I met Sharon, I actually owned the first book that Sharon had written, and I sent you a photograph.
Right, that was amazing.
And I'd like dog-eared every single corner, like every inspiring thing. I was like, I've got to remember this. So anyway, I was like so happy to.
Can you guys hear her? Because I know that Sharon and I are extremely loud.
We don't need a microphone, but.
Can you hear her in the back?
Yeah?
Okay, great. Okay, sorry.
I've been in America for 9 years, so I can also speak louder.
That says a lot about American.
Sorry.
No, that's
okay.
Right.
Okay, so an artist residency in motherhood. That was a project that I started in 2012, I think. So I had my first son in 2011. And until then, I'd been a practicing artist, so I went to art school, I lived in Berlin, I've been working as an artist for 15 years. I had my first son, and sort of naively, I didn't really realize how much that was going to shift everything in terms of my art career. Not only did I have sort of very little time and resources, and I was sort of geographically fixed in a way that I hadn't been before, I also realized that I had become invisible. I realized how much parents become invisible when you're walking around with a kid. People don't really see you anymore. I had this sort of I was the main caregiver of our kids. I had this full-time job, and then in the sort of tiny bits of time in between, I'd be trying to practice my work. I'd be like running off to the studio and doing something, but I was exhausted all of the time and really struggling. Also, I felt extremely isolated. So a lot of these sort of thoughts and questions were sort of going around my mind. Also in England, if you're a freelance worker like an artist, there's actually government support, which is amazing here, called the maternity allowance. So you're actually supported financially in the sort of early 30 weeks of your kid's life. And suddenly I realized, like, I didn't have that here, Anyway, so those sort of personal questions became the framework for a project. It was the first time that my personal life really got into my studio world. And the first part of the residency, actually kind of leading up to it, was called Maternity Leave. So it was with the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. I was asked to be part of the exhibition, but it was going to be when my kid was going to be 3 weeks old. He wasn't born, so I had no idea, like, would everything be okay? Could I even do it? So the project that I developed was essentially, my space in the museum was empty. It was a big white space. There was a pedestal in the middle with a white plastic baby monitor on it. And it was called Maternity Leave. And for the duration of the exhibition, I was at home with my child.
Wow.
And there was a live audio link to the museum. So if you went to see the piece, you would hear my absence. And you would hear this sort of usually very hidden private labor was broadcast. It was, but the most important part of the piece was that I negotiated with the museum to pay me the equivalent of the maternity allowance that I would have got in England, but was not in America, for the duration of the show, which was luckily 3 months. So I had this sort of built-in maternity leave.
And that was expressed in the wall text, which I thought was really brilliant.
Yeah, so that was, and it was something that I was struggling with, and everyone struggles with privately, but it was really important to me to be like, this is an issue, this is something that a lot of people are dealing with, and so to sort of have that be a public part of the show. So from that was kind of the first thing, and then from that I realized that, you know, there's a lot of artists here, as you know, like one way that we sort of get peers and make work and get support is by going on residencies, and so many residencies specifically don't invite families. You know, it's about going away from boring everyday life, you know, into some sort of creative utopia, and that often doesn't include partners or children. So I, instead, to sort of talk about that, I decided to take the structure of a residency and then put it over my everyday life. So I stayed at home and I kept looking after the kids, but I did it through the lens of an artist in residence. I was looking at this like wild new world of motherhood as, instead of something to stop me working, it became material to make work out of.
So good.
So I just had like, sorry to have props, I like get really nervous when I talk, so I always have to have objects. But so for example, this is a book called 63 Objects Taken from My Son's Mouth. So this was one project. So really, it wasn't necessarily like about motherhood, but it just put a frame around what was happening anyway and turned that into material to make work out of. And then while I did it for like 3 years, there was a website, and it had a sort of public face, because I was looking for, you know, I didn't want to be isolated and making work for myself, so I would have shows with the work. I was lucky to be able to have shows, and I had a website, and a lot of women in particular contacted me and said, I want to do this, like, how do you do this? Who gave you, you know, who said you could do this? And I was like, I made it up. You can do it. So I made a website that kind of, that gave whatever it was I had to give. I mean, it was really just a mental shift, you know, but I made a website that gave tools to support that mental shift in other people. And then I published it on Mother's Day, I think it was 2016, for anybody to take and make their own. So they're not doing my project, they're just taking that idea and then they're embodying it however makes sense for their particular lives.
And dads are now involved too, right?
Dads have always been invited. I called it, I left the name of motherhood because I wanted to honor that very particular situation. I mean, people ask me questions that they never ask my husband or other dads. You know, it's a very specific invisibility, and I wanted to honor that starting point, but it's absolutely open to anybody to take on. Yeah, and right now there are like 450 artists in residence in motherhood in like 36 countries.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing.
That's amazing. That's extraordinary. And I love one of the things that I love about the generosity of that gesture is also that it is a critique at the same time, and that I think both this book really helps us see the challenges that artists face and understand them better. And you know, when you think about the residency, most of the most prestigious residencies, as you said, are really meant for, you know, without spouses or kids or partners, and I think that is something that we have to be more mindful of. And I loved when you, artists I think are some of the most hardworking people that I know in the world, and shortly after I met Lenka, I discovered that, you know, she was raising her kids and making art from her home, and that she and her husband though each had one day where they could be in the studio all day, and your day was Sunday and I think your husband was Saturday, but they called them, I was reading in the book and I didn't realize that you called them your McDowell days.
Yeah.
It was like, which is in reference, just today, like they published the list of people who got McDowell fellowships, but I love that idea of, you know, of thinking about the residency and turning it on its head and making sure that it's different. And so community and generosity come up again and again in the book in wonderful ways, and I know it was a prerequisite for you, Sharon. But I also thought it was interesting how often mentorship comes up, and you know, I think those of us who work in offices in set fields, like we, you know, are accustomed to looking for mentors in our field, and I almost wonder if mentorship matters even more as an artist in a way, because it's a practice where you are often working in your studio perhaps alone, and I just was curious how important, I want to start with you, Sharon, how important have mentors been to you, and how have you sought them out too? Like, where have you found them? It's not just bosses, you're your own boss. So I'm just sort of curious about mentorship, and also if you consider mentorship an important part of your practice as an artist yourself.
Oh yeah, I mean, I actually think in my own work too, sorry, do I have to lean in here?
I think you're okay.
Yes, because I'm loud and clear. I think with even my own work, I decided that it's just so much better to do it with somebody else. Like the book has taught me that too. Like I used to do these big museum projects, like just big as far as scale for sculpture, and I've just decided that I don't need to do that. But it does come from, I think mentorship is not necessarily teaching per se, but always our community. I don't know if you would agree with this, but the people who are I have a tight circle of people who I trust a lot, who we text every day. Some of them are in these books, and we converse, we work together, we make art together, we do a lot together, we eat together, it's sort of like it's like a house in a way. And I think at 53 years old, I just know intuitively who those people are and who to trust. Some people, and they're all different. They're not just artists, but they're creative. I think that also the art world is not so divided anymore. So like museum directors, like for example, Adam Weinberg, who gave me the quote on the back of this book. I always thought of him as an artist, because he's like an artist. And I never think of him as a museum director.
He's unusual. There's not many like him.
Right, exactly. Seriously, you would know more than me, right?
No, it's true.
He just is so different in that way. But he is an exception, but there are other people like curators that I know, or just people who are critics, writers. They sort of flow in and out. Like it's not so divided so much. And I don't divide anybody. I don't have everybody on silos. We're all on the same plane. And I think the books for me did that too, is they showed that even like the most, quote, famous artists from perception, the reality is they're really similar to everybody else. And we're all in the same boat. Sure, money makes a huge difference, but at the same time they have their issues too, just like other artists do. So as far as back to the mentorship, it's just this natural exchange, and community is essential, because that's how opportunities happen, is from that internal group and then beyond. And it's true, when artists give to other artists, things happen. So often I hear, especially on this tour, from dealers, curators, collectors, they hear from other artists. They get things from other artists, and artists referring other artists, and making those opportunities, and those people also follow those artists who do that.
And was that community that you had, before we turn it to Lenka, is that community that you described, that you text daily and that is sort of your tribe,
Yeah,
is that mostly
totally.
from grad school, or is a lot of those folks from grad school, or is it collected along the course of your life?
No, not from grad school.
Okay.
When I left graduate school, sorry. No, it's not a bad thing. I mean,
very
I
clear.
don't know what that means. I am a very transparent to a fault. I have some friends from grad school. When I left graduate school, I had $115,000 in debt in 1991. I paid those debts off in 10 years as an artist. And part of the reason for doing that first book was that how come artists weren't sharing enough with one another? Why can't we share with one another? So I found that tribe through those people who believe and breathe the same way. The people I know who are in my tribe, it's natural just to give. It's like an honor to give and to create opportunities for others. But we also monitor or police our community too. Like we call people out, we're not afraid of breaking the mold and creating different rules too. I think that comes from the power of us as artists. But oftentimes a lot of artists, they care too much or they're too fearful. I used to be that way. I'm not that way at all.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit too, so we won't forget that.
Yeah, sorry.
I think that's important. And Lenka, for you, in terms of mentors, I must admit I'm thinking of something you did that you write about in the book of two people that you wrote. But I know you have other mentors, but I would love to hear you share that because it was a pretty remarkable story.
Yeah, sure. So when I went to art school in London, and when I was 19, so in the second year at art school, we had to do work experience, which is like internship in America, as an artist. And a lot of people went to work in galleries and things, and I couldn't figure out how you would do work experience as an artist. But my two favorite artists at the time were Jimmy Durham and Mark Dion. They still are two of my favorite artists, and I wrote them both letters that are really embarrassing now when I reread them, but they were basically like fan letters, like, I love your work, you're incredible, can I be your assistant? And they amazingly both wrote back and said yes. So I went to live with Jimmy for a month in Berlin, and worked with him and his partner, and we would go like shopping together looking for materials, and we tried to do fundraising to come up with enough money to sink a barge on a way full of rock on a way back from the quarry in Sweden. I mean, just like crazy projects for a 19-year-old kid. Like I grew up in a Cornish fishing village, so for me this was like extraordinary. And then Mark Dion, I worked with him in Lancaster on a project that he was doing there, and then I ended up being a project manager for him on a project at the Tate called the Tate Thames Dig, and then I was sort of a babysitter and an assistant and a translator for a long time when he used to tour around Germany. So it was really, I mean, to me it was completely extraordinary that they gave me the time of day, but it was really sort of a very important transition for me, sort of being alongside professional practicing artists and just sort of sharing their lives for a while. And I actually now also do mentorship, so I used to do the whole adjunct thing, adjunct teaching thing, and a year and a half ago I decided to stop doing it. And the thing that I loved most about it was the chance to work one-on-one with students, with artists, and really get to know them deeply and support them, like meet them where they are and support them where they wanted to go, and to have that sort of very personal relationship. And now I've sort of created a structure, sort of through the residency and motherhood, but I also work with people who don't have kids. It's like a 6-month mentorship program where we work together on their career goals, and it's sort of become actually one of the most important parts of my practice. I think of it as really part of my practice.
And those are people in Pittsburgh, or are you doing
No,
this?
they're everywhere. So there's one, all over the world. So there's people in Europe I'm working with at the moment. There's one woman who lives on a reservation in Australia, like as far away as you can
Where?
get. East Kimberley.
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah.
I think I know where that is.
Yeah,
We were just
sort of
there.
north, west.
Amazing.
Yeah, and in America too, but no one in Pittsburgh actually. It's all Skype.
Well, and I also, one of the things I was struck by in the book is that you describe the way you funded being,
Oh, right.
because you were an unpaid assistant to them, right? You
Yeah.
didn't ask them to pay you,
But
but
no, I was unpaid for the first month, and then I was paid when I started working for Mark. He paid
right.
me when I was
Okay, you did.
Yeah, and it was also, I mean, it was England, so there was no tuition. There is now, but there was
Yeah.
no tuition at the time. We got a grant to go to school, and I was independent financially, so I paid to go to Berlin by making an edition, I was a printmaking student, and I made like a printed edition of spectacles that were like cardboard, and in the lens were things that I might see if I got enough money to go to Berlin. It was like an early handmade Kickstarter or something, and I like forced everyone to buy them, and that like funded the trip.
But that's amazing. I mean, I think you've been resourceful your whole career, and we have to think outside the traditional structures in order to make some of these things happen.
Yeah, resourceful and just having the need. I mean, otherwise, like there was, there was no other way to do it. And I think it was the same with my peers too. Like people weren't, it wasn't normal then to be funded by your parents to go through college at all. So everybody sort of everyone had several jobs, and everyone was sort of figuring out ways to afford materials and meet who they wanted to meet and go where they wanted to go. It was in the culture.
Yeah, and since you mentioned day jobs, I wanted to talk about that a little bit, because it comes up.
I hate that word.
Yeah, but it comes up in the book a lot in terms of people being candid about talking about not just where they went to school and who their professors were, but the various jobs that they've had to support their careers. And I think the traditional metrics of success in the art world, you often think it's like quitting the day job, which I think this book makes clear that actually they can be incredibly productive to your artistic practice and community building. And then the other metric that I think we often sort of tired metric or outdated metric is this notion of landing in New York Gallery, which I think all of the artists in this book have very vibrant careers, and I mean, you have a New York gallery, but I feel like many people in the book do not, and have very vibrant and by my measure, successful careers. So I wondered, Sharon, if we could talk, I mean, you said that 400 people showed up at a talk about, the gallery, the dealer and all of that, but I think I appreciate the range of voices you included, and I think especially now as galleries are starting to change beneath our feet, and they're just, the big ones are getting bigger, and the middle seems to be dropping out a little bit, and I think artists are going to need more and more to be able to sustain their own careers without without necessarily landing a New York gallery or any gallery even. So I wondered if you could talk. Were you drawn to artists for whom did you respond to artists in some ways who have built their own careers and lives separate from that system, or is it just part of our culture now? I mean, I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about that relationship.
Well, two thoughts. First, I don't believe in the term day job, because even if you have a job doesn't mean you're any less of an artist, period.
Right.
So that's out. I want all the foundations to erase that. Language is important, so I would like to see that go. We choose our lives. And if artists can make intended decisions as to where we position ourselves. A good example is Jean Shin positioned herself at the Whitney because she wanted to be around certain people that could inform her and her well-being. I mean, artists not only contribute to the economy, but more than anything, we contribute to the well-being of others. She wanted to find that for herself and learn from people at the Whitney, and then she was able to take that and then use that platform to be able to grow her community, which has been outstanding for her. But she thought about that. That was intended.
Yeah.
The second thing about choosing the artist, in my first tour, I had artists come to me and say, you can't do these other things like you're talking about, right? And your just examples of your resourcefulness, and have a gallery. You can't do that. Like, a gallery's not gonna let you do that. I was so mad about that, like infuriated. That was one side of it, and then the other, these books are therapy for me. That's basically what it is. So one side is that part of the artist, and the other side from the first tour was that the public was still looking at us like, when I would say I'm an artist, they would start to see if I could speak in completed sentences like I'm trying to do here, or that I could take a shower, or I wasn't wearing clothes, I looked normal. And so those two things bothered me. So for the second book, I wanted to, because when I would say an artist was a cultural producer, they would say, what is that? They would not think of an artist as a producer of culture, but we've always been doing that.
Yeah.
So again, as language, changing that language, so the book has, every artist in this book has some leg in the commercial art world, and then they have a bridge to the public and what they do for the public. But I was drawn to that because that's our future, is that the gallery is always just one part of the ecosystem and not everything.
Yeah.
And if I love my dealers, I think they're amazing partners, but if I had just depended on them, I would be on the street. I would be on the street. I mean, I've told, no offense to them at all, because I'm very fond of them, but that's not how I sustain my creative life. And so I create my own opportunities to sustain my creative life.
And I think everyone in the book does that. I love Shanique Smith.
Oh yeah, she's great.
Has a really great, she has some great comments and observations about the gallery world, and she describes it as a relationship as not romantic, but like a marriage of sorts where communication is key, and being single is better than being married for the wrong reasons.
Hello! That's a good point. Wow, it's so great that you read that. I saw that when she had that in the first draft of it, I was like, bam, we gotta keep that in there.
No.
She's actually really generous about the art world. Like I wanted her in this book because she has helped so many other artists with that part of the art world, meaning that referring other artists to dealers, but also she's been very realistic with other artists and saying, do you really want to do this? I know about this. I think part of our duty to one another too is to be truthful, even if it's going to be painful. It's better to have that truth than to lead down that path that she's talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the art world that I feel a part of, the first artist that I ever really seriously worked with was Saul LeWitt, and he was very much the same type. And I remember Adrian Piper telling me that when curators would visit Saul LeWitt's studio, she was in the same building upstairs, and before she really had a reputation, he would always literally walk them upstairs to her studio and make sure that they visited her.
Right.
And I think that this just makes the art world a better place. As you said, it's part of those are the artists that I'm drawn to as well. But,
can I just add to that really quick?
Yeah.
I do think that artists, if you have an opportunity like what Adrian did, or Saul LeWitt, share it.
Yeah.
Because I'm in a residency program right now in New York, and a bunch of us are getting names of curators together to share with everyone. How does that benefit everyone? It creates more opportunities for all of us, which I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I want to ask you this question a slightly different way, a little bit, Lenka, in terms of the gallery situation. But I also, I did want to talk, and then we'll turn it over for questions in a moment. I did want to talk about geography briefly. I mean, we're, Sharon, I know you're based in New York, but you lived in Minneapolis. You and Vincent lived in Minneapolis for many years. And Lenka, you moved from a small seaside to, well, I know you weren't in a small seaside town when you moved, but you moved from Europe to Pittsburgh, and you've been there for almost a decade. And I'm just curious, how has where you lived sustained or stifled your creative lives, and what advice might you have for artists living in Austin? Because I'm curious.
Oh, that's very important.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I moved there sort of weirdly with absolutely no plan. So I had no expectations. I didn't know anything about Pittsburgh at all. It could have been anything at all. I'd never even seen a picture of it when I moved there. Basically, I moved there with my husband, and we were trying to decide where to move. And some people make like very careful Excel charts of like the best place to move to. I just had a vision where I saw the word Pittsburgh written in like 3-dimensional yellow letters in my mind's eye. And I was like, let's move to Pittsburgh. So that was like exactly how planned it was. We sort of thought that we'd be there for a few months and then see what happens. And I guess we just stayed. Like we never sort of felt like it had stopped offering things to us, or like it stopped expanding. I mean, in some ways it's shifting now, but in some ways it's a kind of, it used to be a booming steel town, and then, the pit they closed and jobs went, and it became a sort of depressed town, and now it's sort of on the up and people are coming back, and but it's sort of a little bit frozen in time because it didn't ever go through the 80s thing, so it still really looks like itself, and it was a city that was built for 1 million people. The infrastructure is for 1 million, but there's only 300,000 people who live there.
Wow.
So it sort of feels open in some ways. I mean, I lived in London and Berlin before for most of my career, and those places really frustrated me. I mean, you might think that those are incredible art scenes, and for some people, of course, they are, but but they were sort of done. It was like everything was there. It was very expensive to sort of make things happen. Whereas in Pittsburgh, like you can rent a studio extremely cheaply. People are setting up amazing things there. You know, it's flexible. People are optimistic. People are very, very interested in art, which sort of coming from England was very unfamiliar to me, that a whole sort of city would be excited about having artists in its midst. And they really do see, I feel like anyway, they see the cultural value of artists in that city. And that's like been a real gift to me. It's very limited in terms of galleries and exposure and so on. If that's the thing that you're looking for, then you have to sort of find ways to exist outside of the city. But I don't know, I appreciate it as a home base. I don't know Austin that well to give advice, but that's the way that I've sort of found with Pittsburgh.
That's great. And what about you, Sharon?
Well, I mean, just from me personally, we had a house fire, a Christmas night, 2013 in Brooklyn. And that was sort of the last straw in New York where, well, and now it wasn't because I moved back, but I mean, we went through 9/11. My husband's a jazz musician, so his studio was demolished by Hurricane Sandy, and then that happened. We're like, okay, New York, we get it.
Like,
so,
you don't like it. You don't like us.
We're out of here.
Yeah.
So at least for a couple years. But what happened was we moved to Minneapolis because Minneapolis is the #1 funder in the country for the arts. And the citizens of Minnesota voted to tax themselves, I always forget the percentage, I should know this from living there, but a large percentage enough that it accumulates a tremendous amount of money for grants, et cetera. But what I found in Minneapolis, like a lot of other granting places, is that the culture was very exclusive, not inclusive. I'm for inclusive. And also my focus is women and people of color. It was very important for me to have an inclusive environment of people that I want to exchange and collaborate with, and that wasn't there. And I missed my friends. I'm 53. I didn't want to start over. I was really depressed, so I moved back to New York. I'm like, am I crazy to move back to New York? But I think for most people in this book, in these books, they're happy where they are and they make a sustainable life where they are. I think the key is to all of them, and myself as that example, is that you're thinking about what's good for not my career, but my well-being. That it's really important. Like I couldn't function there without these people around me, but also I'm a very loud woman who I'm proud of that, and Minnesota is not that fit. You know? I hate to say I love Minnesota, but they can't handle, the people, whatever. You know, I couldn't handle it either. But anyway, so it just didn't flow. You know, didn't have the connection. So these people in this book who chose where they were, like you did, and make it work for them, also realize a lot of the key to sustainability is Hassan Elahi, who I did an event with in Oregon. We were in Tulsa, Oklahoma together. Don't ask me why, we both just intersected on the tour. And he was saying his observations are that actually no longer a lot of artists, income doesn't connect with residents. That a lot of artists have to travel. Even the ones who are living in these small communities, they travel to urban areas to get either to plug in and then plug back out where they are, and that's pretty common.
Yeah.
So you can live in remote places. I went to Tasmania on this tour, met about 40 artists there. They have older ideas of what the art world I think is. There's all different art worlds. But they make it work on this island out all the way across the other side of the world. There are artists all over the world that are doing that. It just takes a certain drive and planning and finding your fit.
I love what you said about choosing where you live based on not just on your career, but based on your well-being. Because I think that's a hard thing for some of us to do, and I think I haven't heard it articulated so clearly, but I think that's really important. So I want to turn it over for questions from the audience. I'm sorry, the lights, maybe we can adjust the lights a little bit so that they're not straight in our eyes. But so I will try to look and see the hands. I apologize, I might be blinded in the process. But
oh my gosh, now I see what you look like.
Oh good, much better. So I want to open
there's a lot of people here.
I want to open
They're all over here.
Yeah, they're all on the side.
So I want to open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Sharon or Lenka? Yes, Denise.
I'm an artist, and while you were speaking, I started to get this impression that what I had decided my first day of college when I asked what your vision of success was to be around peers who who were very challenging and made me want to make my work higher level. And I have a certain amount of community, and suddenly as you were talking, my vision of what I thought success was kind of went back to that. And I'm wondering if, because I think I have these ideas of like, oh, I don't have enough gallery, I don't have enough time to do these outlets for more shows out of my thing, but I have a good life and I have connections and I have community. And I'm wondering if I'm correct that in a way that's part of what you're saying, that the life that you create, and then if it includes these sort of things that you consider success, like community and connection and giving, and are you sort of saying that that's success, like that's a life, or are you also...
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, or either, anyway.
Do you want to answer that first?
You go.
You know what? I'm never going to determine what success is for an artist. First of all, I'm not going to tell you what that is for you.
Yeah.
Second of all, I think that everybody has a different definition of what that is, and I respect that. But I just know that artists who count on these systems that are failing. There was a report that came out last summer from Art Basel that comes out every 4 years that says across the board that galleries are, mostly mid-level galleries, are down in sales 20 to 30%, okay? And then also there's not enough room for every artist who gets out with an MFA to have I don't want to say representation, because that's such an old word, because that means a lot of different things. It's not what it was in the 1960s. And I think that myth of artists being taken care of from the 1960s, some galleries in the 1960s gave loans to artists rather than against sales, but those sales sometimes didn't happen, and then they owed money to those galleries. So that mystique is over. It never was, actually, across the board. So if all of these artists who want these to try to fit a square into a circle and never get it, I think that's a waste of a life. How can we contribute otherwise? The artists I know who are, quote, successful, they're doing their own thing. They're saying, I'm not going to wait. I have a short life. And they're sustaining their own lives. And they're developing relationships with all different people to create their own opportunities. And I would like to see more of us do that, because I want the power to come back to us rather than giving it over to these systems where then we're beholden to them. Yeah. We don't do that in our studios. I don't know why we have to do that outside our studios. So I can't really answer your question. You have to answer it.
I think she has, yeah. Yes, up there.
In light of that
Just
idea
crazy.
that systems are changing, what do you think that university programs
Oh, God.
do to update?
I need a bourbon. They have good bourbon here in the city, right?
I'll get you some bourbon. I'm just sorry, it'll have to be after the talk.
Do you want to answer that? I feel like I could spend hours on that, but I can.
I feel like an outsider in terms of American university, but is that coming from, are you a professor or are you a student? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that answer that you just gave was so good and clear. I mean, I think so. I mean, I guess I can talk about my education in London, which is so different. I was so shocked when I came here and started sort of going to American classes. In London, we basically had a studio for 3 years. They immediately presumed you sort of went to art school and you were an artist. It was like an instant thing that just happened. And then we had an empty studio. We'd see professors occasionally, and like visiting artists would come in and talk to us occasionally, and that was it. So it was this sort of huge blank space. There was this sort of idea that you might get a gallery one day, and that was sort of one way that you would find success, but it wasn't really talked about that much. There was just this sort of vacuum, really, and so everybody had to make sense of that however they could. You know, people had to sort of figure out what their work was and how to even begin making it and how to think about it, and then they had to sort of figure out where that might exist in the world and how to get it there. So I don't think it was necessarily a great educational system, but there was no hand-holding, there was no sort of demonstration of this is the right way to do it, or this is how to get there. They sort of gave, by sort of neglecting us in some ways, they sort of gave us the power to determine, what our work was and how we got it there, which now, at the time, I thought was terrible. Now I think has really sort of served me.
Well, I'll just say that I think there are deep flaws in education. And it's very funny because I just texted a lot with a really good friend of mine today about these issues. The chairs in the departments that are running the shows, a lot of them these departments are not very diverse. They need to be. They're also, some people are too old in a way where I had a university professor say to me, I said, why don't you try to give some different models to artists to sustain their lives? I said, well, we never got it, so why should I give it to them? That's the stuff I'm hearing. So I don't like that at all, obviously, and I told him I didn't like that. But I think that the thing is, I think more universities have to have good visiting artist programs. I've said this actually publicly a lot. Don't just bring in Jerry Saltz and Roberta Smith. And you can quote me on that because I said it on Twitter to him too. And I think he actually agrees with it. Because the thing is, don't spend $10,000 on them when that's all you have. Why don't you bring in people, artists who actually can make opportunities for other artists, who can create opportunities for them, who can want them to be a part of their community, who then create a seed so that maybe they come back to the university. So smarter thinking, that's a visiting artist program. Then also bring in teachers who are going to do that. I think it all comes from this thought of generosity, which at the end of the day is just being a good person when you get right down to it. So I think that, and then I think also professional development. It doesn't have to be cookie cutter, like, oh, this is how you do this, because there isn't one way of sustaining a creative life. But I do think it's the responsibility of a university, if they're paying for that education, which I wish I had this when I stacked up all those bills to be able to, and all that debt, why couldn't they just give me some opportunities that other artists are doing? I mean, or pathways that they're doing as models, so I can make that decision just like they're teaching me how to paint a painting. So I actually think that has to happen. We have to be more responsible. And if you're teaching, you have a responsibility to do that too. So that's my answer for that. I know I'm really passionate about this stuff. I'm a bulldog about it, but there has to be change in it because then we're not going to go very far. And I see artists graduating and get off the cliff and say, where's my gallery? I mean, that's what they say, and that makes me really sad, actually. Is that what it's all about? Is that why we're doing this? Is that why we're doing it? Hopefully that's not why we're doing it.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more. Let's see. Yes, Kambui.
Oh my gosh.
It's great to hear you all, the three of you all, just snatch it up there. It's as an artist, it gets you really excited. And I'm gonna be brief because I want to hear you talk about this thing that I keep hearing over and over, which is an idea about history. And so you're colliding with this idea of the artist as hero, or teaching artist, as opposed to a working artist or an artist.
Right.
And you brought up Mark Dion, who is entrenched in teaching.
Right.
It is braided into the work.
Right.
And so it's not a separate thing. And I think there's a history, there's a mythology of the artist that somehow the commercial work, the teaching, the being part of a community, all those other alternate things are separate. So I'm wondering, one, how much of this is about a kind of historical document for the future, but also how, what are some of those alternate systems that, come up? Every artist has a lineage. They didn't just show up in New York. It's
Correct.
like they were grinding somewhere else, and this person helped them learn how to weld, and every single artist. So I was wondering if you could share some of those.
Does everybody know Kambui? This guy is amazing. You have to say hello to him and hug him if he'll let you, but he's like such an amazing artist. I'm so excited that he's here. I feel honored to talk to you. I think there are so many different models right now that go way beyond these books. That's why I got from 400 to 40. There were at least 400 that I found of different models. But as far as like what you're saying, it is a whole umbrella. It's not separate. I don't think we've ever really been separate, but people like to put us in these boxes, right? I think it comes from, we need to radicalize art history. I mean, that's a huge part of education. When you talk about education and directing people who we really are, that's one system I would like to see broken. But as far as other artists, I think they create these natural residencies for other artists that then produce naturally education. That's a big thing. But also positioning themselves in places that they feel that there's a need for them. Like for example, Brett Wallace, who's in this book that probably not a lot of people ever heard of, he was hired partially because he's an artist, a big part because by LinkedIn, by the Reid Hoffman, who's the CEO for LinkedIn. And he positioned himself in this because his work has a lot to do with that culture. And by doing that, positioning himself in that place, he's helping 50 startup companies and think way differently because he's an artist. So I think it's a matter of the artist positioning themselves of what is going to be like-minded to them that we do all the time naturally, and then drawing upon to people around us to be able to get what we need too, like to be able to get artists to be drawn to, we're drawn to them to be able to seek what we need to be able to grow. Just like we're trying to reach for different materials or what you've done, or notice what's around us that is creative or how we frame it. That's what we do naturally, right, as creative people. But I think in big part it's paying attention to that. And then taking the risk and not having fear to be able to do that and not ask for any permission, because we don't need it at all. It's part of creativity and free expression, which we have as human beings, naturally. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, and one last question, yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Thank you.
interested when you're talking about positioning just now, and
Yeah.
you can both speak to this if you'd like, but positioning versus posturing.
Oh.
Because I feel like as I was hearing that described, this sort of anxiety crept up in my chest. And I love the notion of positioning, but I feel like it's so close to posturing, and how y'all negotiate that and advice you give other artists.
This is sort of maybe also connects to your question a little bit too. I think it answers what you're asking, but when I sort of came across a boundary when I decided to have kids. I came across this very definite wall where women and men would tell me, like, if you want to be a serious artist, then you shouldn't have kids because it's going to screw up your career. You don't want to take you seriously, you have to, all of that. And I found that to be so despicable and so sexist. No one said that to my partner. And so outrageous. So that was kind of a wall that before I hadn't met sexism head on like that. And I was just like, oh my God, I have to do something about that. And then I also, when I was pregnant, I started Googling like art, mothers, parenthood, and Mary Kelly came up a million times, with that project that was made in 1970. And there was like very
Before you were born.
else. Yeah, I mean, it was really shocking. Like it was a taboo. It was something that we've said shouldn't happen, and then when people had kids, they kind of continued despite it, and it wasn't something. And when I started doing the residency in motherhood, people told me, you're going to get pigeonholed, you're going to be the artist who's like the parent, There were all these sort of reasons not to occupy that space, and I sort of felt it being closed down, which is exactly the reason that I did it. And I worked very, very publicly, and I was like, I'm a parent, and I have kids, and I also make work, which is sometimes about that, and very often not about that. And I sort of publicly just made that my material and decided not to be concerned about it. So there was I purposefully stood in that place and sort of positioned myself in the middle of it.
I think that's a big part of it. Like, it's sort of like if I'll just make it more, because I'm an emotional person, so I'll make it more about love and friendship. because I think it's all about that. I mean, as hippie as that sounds, but I really believe in that. So the people who are my core group of people, I love them to the end of my earth, end of the earth.
Yeah.
And I want to dig deeper with them. But I'm going to stand in front of them and say, we're going to do this together. That's the kind of positioning I'm talking about. Or let's say if I'm drawn to have a relationship with somebody, first of all, I never think of working with a curator or gallerist or whomever as getting something with them. It's actually, I'm collaborating with them, all of them. It's never like they're serving me, which some artists think, which is outrageous, or that if I work with them, I get something else passing through them, which is horrible. They're human beings. There's a human factor to this. So all of the people in my life right now, I've chosen, and I've chosen to collaborate with them. And both in my personal and professional life merges a lot. So the people I choose to have the time with and to grow forward has been amazing for my work. It has freed me to make these huge projects and not be afraid. And also to go to Darren Walker at the Ford, I got that grant from a cold call because I sent him an email and said, I love you. I am sort of have a crush on him. He knows this. But I'm in love with him a little bit. Vince knows. But the thing is, I heard him and I sort of got sort of stalkish in a way because I had this draw to him. But I never knew at the time when I just wanted to collaborate with him. I had no idea he was going to give me a grant. And that's, I mean, when you ask for advice, you get money. When you ask for money, you get advice. So for me, and that's exactly what happened. But that should be a tour t-shirt. No, but that's not what my intention was. My intention was actually more, maybe naive, but more based in that. And I make my decisions based in those things, rather than some big ass show or what have you. So I think it's just the intentionality, and that's what I mean about positioning.
Yeah.
And that intentionality stays really strong. It means that the work gets stronger because of it.
And I appreciate that your intentionality is always paired with transparency too. I mean,
yes.
we talk a lot about this, but I think on the book tour you approached a couple of places and there were one or two that didn't, they're like, we never pay artists for
I'm
talks.
gonna out them.
Yeah.
I'm doing a case study, and in their data, which we just got a major grant, a challenge grant, which I can't talk about right now, but that's coming out soon. They are happy that I'm gonna out them. So there are people that are behind me not being so fearful.
Yeah.
And I told them I'm gonna out them. I said, I can't believe you don't pay artists. You know, that this tour is 100% sustainable, except for the first launching at the Strand, which was a party for 250 people.
Right.
And so for me, that's about value, and it's about who we are today. And for institution, for people who get paid, right, and have full-time jobs, and then we're having a collective agency here. And I want museums to be sanctuary museums where they are safe places for artists to exchange and open access.
Yeah.
And so I personally just don't like that. So they're going to be outed.
Yeah, no, and I think it's important, I think that it's really important that we not think of artists as these sort of special, need to be treated differently. You're hardworking professionals.
Right.
Your labor matters, and I mean,
Thank you.
And I think there's been a little too much of that in the past of, we're not going to pay you because you're going to benefit somehow.
Ew.
You're going to
Die of exposure.
Somehow. Right, exactly. And but I also think artists have more agency than they even realize sometimes.
Exactly.
And, I know of and I'll stop and end in a moment, but I do know of an artist that was working with a close friend of mine who has a gallery in San Francisco, and she helped launch his career, and then a New York artist took him on and said, well, in order to join my program, you have to leave the other one, and he really didn't need to. He could have said, he had power in that situation, and I think he underestimated it, and he could have said, you'll be my primary gallery, but I'll still show. He was a prolific artist. He didn't need to accept those terms. Saul LeWitt he was working with like 120,000 galleries. Some of them hated each other. I just think sometimes we underestimate our own agency, and and I think it's important to share these stories the way your book does, so that it will also make us all feel more. I found the book very empowering and enlightening. So thank you for that.
And I do think though there's a difference between confidence and arrogance.
Yes, for sure.
So I think that and a surety.
Yeah.
Right? But there's a lot of arrogant artists who are narcissistic. They don't even know they're narcissistic, right?
Right.
Because they're narcissists. But I think that to have that confidence and also get over that fear to say, I'd love to work with you, is a big thing.
Yeah, yeah.
It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be, but I think you're helping us make sure it.
Oh, well, that's really kind.
Better path forward. All right, well, I'm gonna whisk them off to sign books, so if you have other questions, don't ask them here, because I'm taking them away, but thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being
And
here.
thank you for